Welcome to the 2012 MSTP retreat, and congratulations to the MSTP program for this anniversary. This is always one of the very special days of the year where we celebrate the accomplishments of our future physician scientists, and today is doubly special because we also have the anniversary of this pioneering program over the decades, and a special visitor who is a friend to many of us and an inspiration to all of us, Professor Les Webster, Emeritus Chair of the Department of Pharmacology. And Les will share with us some of the history of this program, which I think has been written in the pages of journals and hospital records over the decades through the accomplishments of your predecessors in this program. And just looking at the wonderful posters being set up, it's clear that this tradition is being beautifully carried forward to the future. I'd like to thank Cliff for providing Vijay and me with the opportunity to participate today, and Vijay for his energy and creativity that he's put into not only his science but into today's program. And I'd also like to thank and ask you to join me in thanking the very skilled and friendly staff of Cliff's program, Kathy Schultz, Bart Jarmusch, and Jane Vogelsberger, who did the lion's share of the organizational work to make today possible. Les?
Actually, I'm going to say a few words of introduction. So Michael has introduced us very nicely, and I want to thank him and Vijay for a lot of work for this retreat. I realized a few years ago that we were passing our 50th anniversary, and I regret that I didn't take the opportunity to do more at that time to recognize that event. But our program represents the oldest MD-PhD training program in the country, and there's an illustrious past that Les Webster is going to discuss for us in a minute. And I'd just like to introduce Les a little bit. Les did his undergraduate work at Amherst College and his medical school at Harvard, and then actually moved to Cleveland for some of his training as an intern at Cleveland City Hospital. He moved around a few other places, subsequently completed his residency training in Bellevue at NYU in New York, and then a fellowship at Harvard and Boston City Hospital, and then moved back to Cleveland in 1955 and was associated with Western Reserve University and City Hospital for a while. And he moved into research in biochemistry with appointments in biochemistry, medicine, and pharmacology. In 1970, he moved to Northwestern University in Chicago to be the chair of pharmacology there. And then we were fortunate to recruit him back to be the chair of our Department of Pharmacology, which he chaired from 1976 to 1991. And in that same era, he also directed the MSTP from 1979 to 1992, and I think led it through a very important phase. Since 1991, he has continued as an emeritus professor, and he has contributed to programs in pediatric clinical pharmacology and continues as a consultant to the Department of Pharmacology. So Les was a really important figure to our MSTP for many years, and I thought it would be wonderful to get his perspectives. He's been really engaged with the training of physician scientists for a long time, contributed a lot to that. So I'd like to get his perspectives on the history of our program in its 55th year. Les, thank you.
Thanks a lot. Can you all hear me? My gosh, I thought I'd lost my voice and so on and so forth. But I want to share with you just some early thoughts about the MSTP here, its history, and I want to thank Cliff very much for taking the chance of inviting me here after all these years that I've been associated with both the basic science and the clinical departments here. If any of you are really worried, my career looks like Brownie in motion, and maybe yours will as well. So let's start off with the history of the, first of all, MD, PhD training, and then next, the MSTP. And I'd like to start with two questions. Why did Western Reserve, at the time, originally obtain NIH funding for the MSTP? And this happened in 1955, or excuse me, in 1975. And then the second question is, what were the effects of such funding? Then I'll conclude by making a few observations about the future of this program and its graduates. NIH started funding MSTPs actually in 1964 with the first three programs at Northwestern, NYU, and Albert Einstein. The MSTP here, as I said, was initially funded in 1975 under the leadership of Cecil Cooper in biochemistry and Bill Schuster in microbiology. So let me start with some background about the special atmosphere here for combined MD, PhD training during the late 1940s. I'm going to call this the Joseph T. Wern era. As chair of medicine and then dean from 1945 to 1959, Wern attracted a stellar group of scientists and physicians to lead the basic science and clinical departments in evolving a broad interdisciplinary basic science and clinical approach to medical education. Among the basic scientists, starting in 1946, were Harlan Wood of the Wood Building, Mert Utter, both in biochemistry, Les Krampitz in microbiology, joined later in 1949 by Alan Moritz in pathology and Earl Sutherland in pharmacology in 1953. Clinical luminaries included leaders such as John Dingle and Jack Coy, Assistant Dean of Admissions for the Medical School, both in preventative medicine. Charles Rammelkamp, they started in 1946, and then Charles Rammelkamp in preventive medicine in 1950. Hale Ham, professor of medicine and director of research in medical education, also in 1950. And finally, Fred Robbins, pediatrics in 1952 and dean from 1966 to 1980. Now, what about the accomplishments of this group? Well, they were simply extraordinary. Most were elected into either the National Academy of Sciences or into the Institute of Medicine. And both Earl Sutherland and Fred Robbins became Nobel laureates. Sutherland for discovering cyclic AMP, and Robbins as part of Ender's group that first cultivated the polio virus. Along with Wern, John Dingle, Jack Coy, and Hale Ham were major players in designing the new integrated curriculum in 1952 that served as a national model for medical education. This achievement was later recognized by 3 Flexner Awards. Wern in 1965, Coy in 1974, and Robbins in 1987 for innovation in medical education. Bob Ebert, chair of medicine here in the 60s, even exported parts of our program to a minor institution, I think called Harvard Medical School, where he became dean and subsequent Flexner awardee there. The interdisciplinary environment here during this period was just absolutely contagious. This included the junior colleague concept, where everyone's input was appreciated. Informal student, faculty, get-togethers at faculty homes. Annual Gates Mills conferences on medical education, and monthly evening interdepartmental basic science presentations, plus plenty of beer. MD, PhD training per se was departmentally based. Candidates applied to both the School of Medicine and a particular basic science department, usually to train with a certain faculty advisor with approval of the chair of the department. Because of the integrated curriculum, they offered generous amounts of free and elective time during the first 2 years. Combined degree students used this to complete required graduate courses, pass their prelims, and start their thesis research. Most completed the program in 6 to 7 years. Now let me tell you about some of the early MD, PhD trainees. These started with Henry Kingdon, who entered in 1956 and continued with only 1 or 2 per year in the 50s. In the 60s, about 2 to 4 were admitted annually. All were highly qualified, and nearly all graduates later pursued highly successful academic careers. Among others, this group included David Satcher, who started in anatomy here, and he became director of the CDC and later Surgeon General under Clinton. It also included 2 minor characters, Nobel laureates, Al Gilman and Farah Murad, both who started here and trained at Sutherland. And Al won the Nobel in 1994 for the discovery of G proteins, whereas Farad wound up with a Nobel in 1998 for the discovery of NO signaling via cyclic GMP. Thus, Western Reserve School of Medicine, later Case Western Reserve School of Medicine in 1967, was a pioneer in MD, PhD training via an informal program starting in 1956 that benefited immensely from an outstanding faculty and an integrated curriculum initiated here in '52, well before NIH funded the first 3 MSTPs in 1964. Okay, so now let's turn to the early history of the MSTP here from 1975 to 1991. Under the leadership of Cecil Cooper and Bill Schuster, the first one was funded, as I said, in 1975, shortly before a new round of major changes in the basic science faculty. Dean Fred Robbins first appointed me in pharmacology in 1976, followed by Richard Hansen in biochemistry in 1978, and Michael Lamb in pathology in 1980. Then Dean Richard Behrman brought in Fritz Rotman in molecular biology and microbiology in 1981, and Tony Mahowald in developmental genetics and anatomy in 1982. Tony Scarpa in physiology and biophysics arrived later in 1987. As you might imagine, basic science faculty influx and turnover increased dramatically over this period. Changes in our MST, although consolidated into a single program, is still strongly influenced by individual departments. But after an NIH review in the late 70s, several major improvements were instituted. The MST became really centralized. I was appointed director in '78 and became responsible for chairing the steering committee and all aspects of program administration, including organizing site visits, writing grant requests, and recommendations for MSTP graduates. Highly respected MSTP steering committee members from different basic science departments, including Al Kirby, then Dean of Admissions, interviewed and approved all MSTP applicants, their thesis advisors, and projects. The program expanded opportunities for interdisciplinary PhD training and improved integration of the PhD and MD training components. But it only supported 3 to 4 new students annually for the first 2 preclinical years, after which support became the responsibility of the faculty advisor. The grant then funded the students again during their 3rd and 4th years when they completed their clinical clerkships after earning the PhD. Implementing all the above changes was no mean feat. Absolutely critical to its success, and still is today, the running of the program by the MSTP administrator and coordinator. So who really did the heavy lifting? Well, one is Ann Goodridge, sitting right over there, who's joined us today. Please wave your hand, Ann, so everybody can see you. Ann did a fabulous job improving the program when she joined me in the late 70s, remaining until her husband, Alan, sitting right next door, left to become chair of biochemistry at Iowa in the late 80s. Felicity Katz, who will probably join us later today, and now Kathy Schultz, have since carried out the tradition of superb service initiated by Ann. And now, what about the careers of the MSTP graduates who entered our program in the late 70s and early 80s during Ann Goodridge's watch? I'll mention only 3 as early examples of many more. Mark Kay, who started in anatomy in 1980, is now professor of pediatrics and genetics at Stanford. He's noted for his scientific contributions to hemophilia and other inherited diseases. Michael Yaffe started in 1981 in pharmacology, is an expert in the integration of signaling pathways that control cellular responses. Mike is now professor of biology and biomedical engineering at MIT. And James Griffo, who will join us later started in biochemistry in '78 with Bill Merrick. And he's an authority in pre-implant genetic diagnoses. He's professor of OBGYN at NYU. Their success is part of a general pattern. Most of our MSTP's graduates wind up in academic careers, largely based in clinical departments, here and elsewhere. And most, but not surprisingly, are involved in translational research. But their interests and careers vary markedly. Indeed, I'm probably talking to another group of future greats right now. So finally, what about the future of the MSTP and its graduates? After my retirement in 1991, the program was led by Steve Yonkin in pathology before John Nilsson, chair of pharmacology, took over in 1995. Then, as you well know, Cliff Harding assumed this responsibility in 2001. But the fundamental features that I described still characterize our MSTP today, even though the medical curriculum has changed to incorporate problem-based learning and reintroduce the MD research thesis requirement. The MSTP also facilitates early admission to the graduate training component and greater flexibility for entering and completing the final clinical clerkships. Indeed, the MSTP here is expanded to include a total of 80 to 90 candidates, with 10 to 11 admitted each year. Moreover, the commitment of such outstanding leaders as Cliff Harding and George Dubiak bodes very well for its future. As noted by a 2008 AAMC study, MSTP graduates nationally continue to expand their career choices. Most in academia have clinical rather than basic science faculty appointments, and they also have been very successful in obtaining highly competitive grant funding for their research. Interestingly, their demographics have changed as well. Many of our MSTP participants now are married, and about a third are women. So how will you present MSTPers fare in this era of uncertain clinical and basic science support? In my view, the secret is passion for whatever you decide to do. You are all very bright and should obtain MSTP credentials as well. Just go for it, and boy, I'll sure bet on you. Thanks very much. I think everybody...
Does anybody have questions for Les about the history of the MSTP?
I probably can't answer them anyway. So
one thing that I'm really struck by is that the flexibility of the medical curriculum, starting back in the 1950s,
right,
which we still have today, has been one of the continuous features. And it's interesting. Nationally, MD-PhD curricula have evolved. There's a different standard, if you will, for expectation of how well-developed and well-integrated MD-PhD training curricula are now than 10 or 20 years ago. But I think we've been ahead of the curve on virtually every stage of that, because one of the things that's now an expected theme is integration, and many programs really didn't have that until the recent era. Some actually still struggling with it.
Sure.
And we've had it to some degree since the 1950s, although perhaps not as much in the PhD phase. I wanted to ask you about that, Les. So my perception is that in the preclinical medical school years, that graduate course activities were integrated in, starting back in the very early time.
Oh yes, very early. I think Ann can testify to that as well. As a matter of fact, one of the nice things was we could basically tailor a program to the individual student and often the department or faculty advisor. The other thing I've noticed is that the range of choices has expanded tremendously. For instance, dermatology or ophthalmology might be a career that would be considered today, and with first-rate research in basic science to complement the clinical component. So I see all kinds of opportunities. The other thing I have to mention is that so many of you people have been terrific musicians. All you have to do is go and attend Dock Opera. And if you can withstand all the insults, which I had many of, it's a great experience. Some of these people had cut records and everything else before they even joined the MSTP, and some of them have done it later on. You've got philosophers, writers, everything else. So the history is very rich, as in terms of what people decide to do. I think it gives you a lot of options.
Any other questions for Les? Les, I would like to present you with a token. A token gift for all your contributions over the years.
Oh my God.
It's a clock, and it says Les Webster, MD, on the front, and inside, Les Webster, in grateful recognition for your guidance and support, CWRU MSTP, MD PhD training since 1956, Winter Retreat 2012.
Thank you very much.